Hey guys, welcome to the Talking It Out podcast, and we're going to be talking about all things sex, love, singleness, and walking with Jesus as a young adult in today's world. My name is Nathaniel. I am one of your hosts.
And my name is Brielle. I will be the other host.
Today we're going to be continuing this conversation on boundaries. If we remember from last week, or 2 weeks ago, whenever these are going to be released, we kind of gave an overall kind of general definition of boundaries. That being, boundaries are where you begin and where you end, right? That's kind of the most simple way to put what is a boundary. And today we're going to be diving a little bit deeper and going into what are the different types of boundaries. Brielle, do you want to share what are the different types of boundaries we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, so briefly, last time we talked a little bit about the types, and today we can give you a few examples. So the types that we talked about briefly: physical boundaries, emotional boundaries, and spiritual boundaries. Nate, I imagine that you mentioned you work with youth ministry. You probably see a lot of people dating, meeting new boys, meeting new girls, and saying like, hey, can I do this? Can I do that? What's allowed? Like, do you have any examples of things that people come to you and ask for advice or direction when it comes to boundaries?
Yes, absolutely. So I guess we're getting started with going into physical boundaries. I love the way you kind of said that, right? Because oftentimes that question is posed, like, what is allowed? Which is so interesting because I think working in youth ministry, you when someone asks that question, it's clear to me that they're trying to figure out how much can I get away with, right? Like, you're trying to figure out the heart of that question, and it's appropriate question, right? Like how much can I get away with, right? Because we're trying to figure out like how can I express affection and love, but what is going to be pleasing to God? What's going to get me in trouble? So there's usually a little bit fear that's associated with that question. And oftentimes I want to be careful when I'm giving physical boundaries. The reason being so is that I feel, this is a little personal tangent, I guess, that we're going to go on. I feel like we as the evangelical church, we've kind of subscribed to just giving worldly advice when it comes to physical boundaries. I think like we just take like the best dating tips that don't necessarily violate what we believe, and we give that to the youth, right? We're like, oh, like make sure that you're not moving too fast. Make sure you're which is very equivalent of just like make sure you don't kiss on the second date. Like it's like, or the first date. We give these like kind of moral, therapeutic, deistic ideas, and we pass that off as advice. So usually if I'm trying to help somebody in the youth come up with a spiritual boundary, I'm always trying to take them to the person of Jesus. And I hate those bracelets, like those WWJD bracelets. I think they're so stupid. I'm sorry if you wear one, but it's like, I don't think like I've never seen a WWJD bracelet stop somebody from sin.
Right.
Like I don't think someone's like, oh man, my parents are really, really, making me really angry. And then they look at their bracelet and they're like, I'm not going to talk back to them. Like that just doesn't happen. Nor in the instance of like, if you're dating somebody and it's new to you and it's exciting, and you're like, oh man, this person, I really want to kiss them. And then you look down at your wrist and you're like, oh, but what would Jesus do? I hate that thought because I've never seen it be helpful, but I think when you're reminding yourself that the person in front of you carries the image of God, and you also carry the image of God, that you are both sons and daughters of our Creator. Okay, cool. Let's come in with that mindset and see, okay, what's appropriate for two sons and daughters of the Father to interact with one another. And then you're like, oh, okay, we just started dating. We've been going steady for 3 months. Maybe we're taking this a little bit too far. And maybe we aren't honoring God and actually using these boundaries that we made. We're not using this physical affection that we're using to actually glorify and build a relationship with our Father. Which doesn't sound sexy. Like I recognize that. Like there's no hard lines with kind of giving that type of advice, because you're like, okay, well, just tell me not to kiss them, or tell me not to hold hands with them, or tell me not to be alone with them. Like, sure, yeah. that may work for you, that may not work for you. Because at the end of the day, you can have as many boundaries as you'd like, but depending on what that relationship with God looks like, your sin might be taking over some things. Because you might have that boundary in place, but you're like, today boundary's not so strong. I'm gonna dive a little bit deeper. And then when you look at it like, oh, I've violated this rule, I've messed up.
Mm-hmm.
You're not looking for reconciliation. You're just looking for, I guess I'm not gonna do that again.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. I mean, that is such a reminder, both in dating relationships and out of relationships, that the people we are in community with, the people we have relationships, are sons and daughters of the Most High. Like, they are
Come on.
created in the image of God. And gosh, that's such a reminder, even just for myself, like day in and day out, like, how are we communicating with people? How are we interacting with people? I love that. And yeah, just that idea that it's less about rules and yes and no, and more about the relationship. And that almost in some ways, or in many ways, right, how we have relationships with people models our relationship with Christ. Many people outside the
Mm-hmm.
Christian community, or people even that look at like, oh, Christianity, so you have all these rules and you can't do a lot of stuff, right? Like, I've heard that. I'm sure many of us have. And that would be almost the same as, actually, there's not anything that I can't do. Is because of my relationship with Christ that I am choosing to live a life doing these things or acting in a certain way by choice because of my relationship with Christ. And if we take that idea to our relationships,
Mm-hmm.
then it doesn't become as formulaic, right, as we would think that it would be. Oh, because of
Yeah.
this, I can't do this, but I can do this. But how are we honoring these people as image bearers of Christ and sons and daughters of the King?
Exactly. And I'm thinking, um, how silly it is to think that Christianity is a list of do's and
Right.
don'ts, right? Because like in Christianity, you're finding true life. You're finding this person of Christ. Going back to like the Imago Dei, like there's this blueprint on how you are to best function
Mm-hmm.
as a human.
Mm-hmm.
And Christianity offers that to you, and it offers this freedom to actually be yourself and not have this weight of sin and shame
Mm-hmm.
kind of hold you down and prohibit you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I think these boundary conversations are so important, because we're saying no to the phony. We're saying no to the fake version of ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
the version of ourselves that's only meant to kind of bring chaos. And we're
Mm-hmm.
saying yes to the fullness of the person of Jesus and how that interacts with us and transforms us to be our best version of ourselves.
Yeah.
And it isn't like this self-help gospel, but it's just like, no, you have an intended purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to like dating and when it comes to building a family and like expanding the kingdom, you have a role to play with that. Whether you're single, whether you're dating, whether you're married, you have a distinct role to play into that. And when you say yes to Jesus, you're just so much closer to fulfilling that goal because of that restored relationship you have with your Father. So yeah, I love what you said. Like some people like look at Christians, like they look at us and like, why can't you do that? Like, I don't know, why can't you watch Game of Thrones
Right.
or something stupid like that? But yeah, but I mean, not all physical boundaries are necessarily romantic
Mm-hmm.
like that, right? Like I just work in youth, so I tend to be a little bit more
Right.
passionate about that. And I see my friends struggling. Yeah, I think that's just a good point to make, that not all physical boundaries are limited to romantic relationships.
Absolutely. And for any type of boundary that we'll give some examples for today, it ties back into that idea of, and I think we talked about this last time, but understanding your own values, understanding, what's important to yourself. And knowing yourself and knowing your why and your how and your
Mm-hmm.
what. In a practical sense, right? Just breaking it down in a practical sense, physical boundaries in a non-dating relationship might look like just communicating to someone like, hey, I'm not much of a hugger, I'm more of a handshake type of a person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or physical boundaries can also be with your stuff, right? If you have a roommate, like, hey, do you mind asking if you wear my clothes before before you wear them? Or can you knock before coming into my room instead of just entering in? So things like that, just knowing what's important to you and being able to communicate it to the people that are in your life. Another thing that is tied up in physical boundaries, we can kind of lump them all together, might be like social or time boundaries. And so you could say something to friends, I would love to meet you guys for happy hour, but I can only stay for 1 hour tonight. Or, hey, Sunday afternoons are reserved for family time. Can we pick another day to get together and play games?
And I feel like that's so hard to like implement sometimes though.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes I think you're caring about what other people are
Mhm.
thinking based off of the boundaries that you're creating,
Mhm.
but you don't think about the consequences of not upholding those boundaries,
Mhm.
right? I could think of an example of a buddy of mine to where we kind of stood up till 1 a.m. Drinking some wine. We weren't getting sloshed or anything like that. We weren't being debaucherous or anything like that. It was a birthday party. But my friend had made plans to go to the gym at 6:30 in the morning,
Mhm.
and because that person said yes to kind of staying out late and having a good time, they had to cancel their plans in the morning to go to the gym. And it's such a silly example, but I think it's kind of a perfect analogy of like the small consequences.
Mhm.
But like, let's say my friend did that every single day of the week,
Mhm.
and then all of a sudden, like because there was a compromise and boundaries for that person, like their value of going to the gym, that boundary that they wanted to set up doesn't even exist.
Mhm.
And they're not even able to hit their goals. Like they're not able to get swole and have really nice arms and
Mhm.
present themselves very handsome.
Well, one thing I see a lot, in my counseling practice and with the young women I work with is struggles with emotional boundaries, and emotional
Mm,
boundaries and energy, not in like a weird woo woo sense, but like how much energy do you have to give to someone or something in that moment, right? So an example, a couple examples that came to mind that I've heard recently. One might be telling a friend or a family member or something, hey, when I share my feelings and you mock me or criticize me, it actually makes me want to shut down and not talk anymore. So I'll only share my feelings with you if I know that you're going to respond respectfully. Um, that's one that I've had a conversation with recently. Or another one is a big one. I think last time we talked about like, hey, how do we not take on other people's heavy burdens and heavy emotions and carry them with us, right?
hmm
And so understanding where you're at and then being able to communicate that with someone else, right? We want to be empathetic. We want to be loving and caring for people, but maybe today is just not the day that you're able to do that. And so understanding that and being able to communicate. So something that you could say is like, hey, I have had such a stressful and exhausting week, and I don't know if I have the energy to discuss this topic right now. Do you think we can schedule a time in the next day or two to have this conversation? And then you're telling the person, I still want to be there for you and I still want to work this out and I still want to have this discussion. I'm not going to be able to bring my best self right now. I love to
hmm
sleep it off, rest a little bit, and then I'll be able to bring my full self to the conversation later when we have it. And so those are they're hard to set, right? We talked about it. Boundaries are hard. Boundaries are hard, but they're necessary, right? And I imagine like emotions, right, are very. We kind of talked about very interlinked with spiritual and physical and boundaries. So how do you see that, with your youth that you work with and in their dating relationships?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the person that declines hanging out because of they're not able to bring their best self.
Mm.
And recently I was gonna hang out with a buddy, and he knew I had some things to get off of my chest. Not about him, but just about life. And he canceled on me. But what I appreciated what he didn't do is he wasn't like, "Hey, dog, like I'm sick. There's a star in the sky. I can't hang out today."
Mhm.
He was just like, "Yo, I'm kind of overwhelmed with some of the things that are going on in my life. Are you okay if we reschedule?"
Mm.
Um, and just that honesty in communicating emotions
Mhm.
was so helpful. Was so helpful in kind of how I perceived what are his boundaries and what are my boundaries. And then I was like, totally cool. Like, yo, cool. If you need a day to decompress, trust me, I always got something to get off my chest. So there's nothing new there. So I appreciate when I kind of interact with someone's boundaries and it's clear. as opposed to if I'm interacting with someone's emotional boundaries and it's not clear.
Mm-hmm.
Because usually when it's not clear, there's some confusion and ambiguity.
Yeah.
And just because we as humans, we try to fill in the space with more often than not our insecurities.
Mm-hmm.
We're like, oh, well, maybe my friend doesn't like me. Maybe my friend, is kind of feeling some type of way.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really, I love my friends who just communicate, yo,
Mm-hmm.
today's a bad day for me. Can't hang out with you. Let's reschedule.
Yeah.
That's so helpful. When it comes to like those emotional boundaries, I feel like it's so good to be honest about what we're feeling and what we're going through, especially like with dating and relationships. But I think there's a caveat there, because I think whenever there's emotional boundaries kind of within a dating relationship,
Mm-hmm.
often than not, there's physical boundaries that are kind of running congruent with them. Because usually when you're having these like big, high emotions and you're like, oh man, I feel the world for you. Like I'm already plotting out, you're my future wife, you're my future husband. We've named our dog Sparky, like we've built this whole life
Mm-hmm.
together. Then all of a sudden in this life where you've kind of created marriage and you've created this utopia, with that comes the physical affection pieces as well.
Right.
So it's just like when we're working on one boundary, we need to be keeping in mind the other.
Mm-hmm.
So just as good as we are setting physical boundaries, right? We're acting, does this bring me into a closer relationship with Christ and this person in front of me? The same thing with our emotional boundaries. And sharing all that you are and all that you're planning and all that you're feeling, is that bringing you closer to Christ and this other person?
Mm-hmm.
Or is this kind of isolating you into your own little utopia,
Mm-hmm.
to where like you have this little safe bubble where you can
Yeah.
feel whatever you want to feel and there's no consequences for that?
Yeah.
Because oftentimes in the real world, there are consequences, whether good or bad, of being vulnerable and sharing that emotional life that you're experiencing.
Yeah. Oh, and I love that. I mean, how you said isolating yourself into a little bubble in utopia. And Adam, this could be a whole other conversation, right? Of just about the importance of not isolating yourself within a dating relationship. And maybe that's a boundary too, but maybe it encompasses all of them: physical, emotional, spiritual, when it comes to dating relationships. But the importance of inviting people in, both, continuing to see God in your relationship, but also inviting, friends and family into be a part of your relationship, and not isolating yourself, and not making this person that you're dating into essentially an idol, right? Where they're your everything. They're meeting all your emotional and physical and spiritual needs, and then what? So.
And that brings us to kind of our final boundary that we wanted to kind of talk about, kind of give some examples, spiritual boundaries. Because I think in the midst of all of this, like that spiritual boundaries is at play, right? We've talked about that spiritual boundary and the physicality of dating and relationships. And we've also talked about it within that emotional life. And like for single folks, like this still applies to you, right? Like you're still, even though you're single, you're still sexual. So when we're talking about physical boundaries and emotional boundaries, like, yes, you are creating those as well. You're inviting people into your life, as long as you have community. And just because it may not be like physically with another person that that is dating or reciprocating emotions, like you still have feelings either for others, or you're still feeling something about yourself, like there's still some sexuality there. That doesn't mean it's always erotic though. And same with emotional boundaries, it doesn't mean it's always romantic at the same time. So these spiritual boundaries that we have in place, like they're always there. That was a little tangent to my single folks. And I think spiritual boundaries is so important to talk about, because I think it encompasses the spiritual boundaries that you set up should therefore impact these physical and emotional boundaries that you're trying to set up as well. But I think oftentimes we think that if we have healthy physical, healthy emotional boundaries, that the spiritual realm is just going to kind of take care of itself because you're doing your job right.
Yeah. And I would wonder, I mean, if it's the exact opposite of that, right? Like instead of just assuming like, oh, well, as long as I'm kind of doing XYZ right, like you were saying, and maintaining these boundaries, and the spiritual will take care of itself. And rather we should start with our spirituality, right? We should bring everything to Jesus. Start all our days in prayer and in the word, and really understand like our relationship with the Lord first, and then the other types of boundaries are, flow from that, right? They grow out of the, that root. They're the byproduct of understanding who we are as image bearers of Christ, and understanding who Jesus is and his examples, and all that stuff. And then, so yeah, it goes opposite of like what we would naturally assume of like, oh, well, spiritual will take care of itself. And for some reason, our spiritual life, our spiritual boundaries, like those are the first ones to go often, right? I don't want to overgeneralize, but
Mm-hmm.
often that's the first thing that goes.
Yeah, and that's even more so like when you look at the person of Jesus, you see him setting kind of a little bit of a spiritual boundary, right? Like you see him waking up early to pray. You see him finding alone time. You see him seeking out the Father, like pretty explicitly, like, yo, let's come into contact with one another. And then you kind of see, okay, he's inviting certain people into that, not inviting others. And he's kind of like, I really, really am close with you three. I'm close with you guys, but I'm really, really, really close with you three, and I'm inviting you into this. When we're setting up these spiritual boundaries, like, are we taking it and are we taking it as seriously as Jesus was doing that? Because we have moments to where Jesus being tempted, right? But by Satan, and then he goes and then he needs some alone time with some angels, and he needs to be fed and he needs to be nourished, right? And he wasn't like, all right, after I just had this huge temptation, let me go out and speak to the masses immediately. Let me go out and host a little kumbaya with the homies, and talk about our feelings. He's like, no, I need to be replenished, right? Um, and he wouldn't have done that unless he had boundaries, I'm assuming. I mean, he is the perfect son of God. So,
Right. Well, absolutely. Is like, so often we hear, or maybe, we talk about that idea of like guilt for setting boundaries and stuff like that. And we're like, but I'm a Christian. I care about people, and I want to love people well. And that's not being very kind and loving. And, you go back to that idea of like the WWJD bracelet. We assume that like, well, Jesus would say yes to everything and do but
mm,
there's so many examples, like you're saying, in the Bible where that's not the case. And I love that, that idea that how can we even model our own boundary making after Christ? Like he did go off on his own to pray. And we have examples of him taking a nap. And we have examples of him leaving the crowds and the masses to go off alone or just bring his close people with him. And we have examples of, I mean, even in the healing, right, of Jesus asking other people to partake in their healing, right? Like, do you want to get well? Then take up your mat and walk, right? Jesus could have
mm,
just, if he wanted to, like, done it all. But like, we have that example of how come, he met us halfway, he met people halfway. There's still effort. And so sometimes we feel like we have to do it all and be all and give everything, and that's the only way to be loving, when Jesus shows the opposite of that. Like, Jesus shows that, like, as the most loving person that ever has walked this earth, as the only perfect person, as the only one that truly loves everybody in a way that we can never comprehend, going off alone and having people that he's closer with than other people. And he does set the perfect example.
yeah, and I feel like he gave the true power of the statement no.
Yeah.
And he gave it like such a positive light.
Yes.
Like Jesus wasn't just saying no for the sake of like, nah, that's annoying.
Yeah.
Like, Peter, you should, get thee behind me, Satan. You're talking a little bit
Mm-hmm.
too wild right now. I'm gonna flex, but like he said no because what he was saying no to oftentimes intruded this boundary of sacredness, intruded this boundary of health,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like going back to like Jesus being tempted, and Satan saying, yo, I can give you the world.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just like, you're not my daddy. You're the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
Like what you're offering to me, even though this sounds so good, at least to me, it probably didn't sound good to Jesus because he had foresight and hindsight. But it's just like, oh, you're offering all of this
Yeah,
power,
power.
and I can do whatever I want, and I can say yes to every single thing that I want. How about I just double dip? How about I be a son of God and then the son of Satan at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, he's saying no. Like, no, this is violating the sacredness, the intended creative order that I'm trying to implement. This is destroying the kingdom. Me saying no to you gives life to my kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
Like me saying no to you, make sure that I can reconcile my brothers and sisters to the Father.
Mm-hmm.
So when he's saying no, he's actually saying yes to so many other things. Right. And oftentimes I think when we say no, we think we're rejecting the world, but it's actually like we're protecting something sacred for
Mm-hmm.
us at the same time. Like when I say no to, maybe to use a little bit more of an explicit example, to watching pornography, when I'm saying no to cheating on my wife, when I say no to ignoring my daughter's cries, I'm also saying yes to like, I'm trying to live the best version of me that I know God has created me to be.
Yeah.
And I'm going to fulfill the responsibilities that are before me. And I'm going to do it to their utmost excellence,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And oftentimes when we're confronted with the boundaries of, do I say yes or do I say no to something? Like oftentimes they're going to impede on the excellence of the things that we're trying to accomplish in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There's the power in the yes and the power in the no. And if we say yes to something, what are we saying no to? And if we're saying no to something, what are we saying yes to? I think of another example where Jesus lays that out very clearly for us is, the well-known example of Mary and Martha, right? And Martha's doing what is good, and she's preparing this meal and cleaning the house and prepping for this big celebration for Jesus coming, and those are good things, right? She was being a good host, and she was making it going to be a nice place for this gathering. And Martha, why aren't you helping me? And so Mary set that boundary for herself in choosing Jesus, and Jesus acknowledges it, right? Like, Mary chose what is good, and Mary chose what's more important in this moment. And so I think of another time too, with Jesus' example, and this is a big one where, even controversial in the Bible, right? But where Mary and Martha call him to come save Lazarus, who is sick, right? And Jesus takes his time. And in the moment, we're like, is Jesus being selfish? Like, why did he say no? Why didn't he go right away? Like, he's good friends with Lazarus. They're supposed to be best friends or super close. Like, right? Why did he wait? Why did he take his time? And then Lazarus had died. But like, that's how the miracle was fulfilled, is because he waited. And so we don't know how, if we look at that example, we don't know what like God can use us by setting boundaries. And we don't know that we can give our best self when we set a boundary in the first place. And instead of giving all of ourselves all at once, we're maybe like hindering the better things from happening.
Yeah. He wasn't fazed by like the social pressure of just like, oh, like these women, they're nagging me. Like he wasn't like, this community's looking at me, they're going to doubt me. He's just like, no, I know what I'm here for. And I need to do it this way. And he stuck with that. I think that's the hard part of boundaries, because it requires discipline and it requires patience. And we see that mostly executed by the person of Christ who took his time, in really stressful situations so he can get it right.
Right.
Like it wasn't like when Jesus was going to be crucified, he's chilling in the garden and he's plotting his escape. Like, man, how can I avoid this? Right? Like he took the time to pray with God and to sit in kind of that emotional, destitute place that he was, and said, you know what, Father, if this is your will, let it be done. And anything else that's contrary to that, I'm going to reject.
Yeah.
And I'm going to follow you. And it's so important to remember that when we're setting up these boundaries. It's just like, Father, whatever your will be done with my boyfriend, with my wife, with my best friend, with my parents, with you, let that be so. I feel like that should be a lot of our prayers when we're coming up with boundaries like this. If you would like to learn a little bit more about this conversation and just even further, check the notes in the podcast. We should have some links. We're going to provide you some resources if you want to dive deeper. In the meantime, this is Nathan and Brielle. And this is the Talking It Out podcast. See you next time.
This podcast was brought to you by the wonderful people at Project 619.